The sound of her boots pounding against the dusty trail was drowned out only by the sobs that racked her body. Lucinda Caldwell raced through the arid New Mexico territory, her skirts hiked up in a most unladylike fashion, not caring who might see or what they might think. Behind her, the sprawling ranch house of her now former fiancé, a place she'd once thought would be her home, grew smaller in the distance. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as she fled, her tears leaving clean streaks down her dirt-smudged face. It was May of 1878, and Lucinda had just discovered that Thomas Whitaker, the man she'd agreed to marry, had been courting the banker's daughter in the next town over. For 6 months, he'd been traveling there on business, while Lucinda had prepared for their wedding, sewing linens and learning recipes from his mother. 6 months of lies, culminating in the letter she'd found, a love letter from Miss Caroline Preston, thanking Thomas for the brooch he'd given her and expressing excitement about their upcoming nuptials. Lucinda had confronted him immediately, only to have Thomas laugh in her face. "Did you really think a man like me would settle for a simple rancher's daughter?" he'd sneered. "You were convenient, nothing more." She'd fled in tears, unable to bear the humiliation, the crushing weight of betrayal. Her father had died the previous winter, leaving her with no one to turn to. She had worked as a seamstress for Thomas's mother, which was how they'd met. Now she had nowhere to go. Lucinda ran until her legs gave out, collapsing beside a small creek that cut through the valley. The water gurgled peacefully, mocking her distress. She buried her face in her hands, her body trembling with each sob. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the landscape in hues of orange and gold. Still, she cried, oblivious to the beauty around her. She didn't hear the approach of hoofbeats, didn't notice the horse and rider stopping nearby, didn't sense someone dismounting until a shadow fell across her hunched form. "Miss, are you all right?" The voice was deep, gentle, tinged with concern. Lucinda looked up, startled, hastily wiping at her tears. A man stood before her, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the practical garb of a working cowboy. His face was partially shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat, but she could see kind eyes studying her with worry. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice cracking. "Please just leave me be." Instead, the stranger lowered himself onto a rock beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Forgive me for saying so, madam, but you don't look fine at all." He removed his hat, revealing a strong jawline softened by compassionate eyes the color of the summer sky. "My name's Matthew Hayes. I work at the Silver Creek Ranch just north of here." Lucinda remained silent, too embarrassed by her disheveled appearance and too wary of strange men to respond. Matthew didn't press. He simply sat there, gazing out at the creek. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice as soothing as the water flowing before them. "You know, my ma used to say that crying alone just waters the ground, but crying with someone waters the soul." He turned to her, offering a clean handkerchief. "You'll never cry alone again, not if I can help it." Something in his words, in the sincerity with which he spoke them, broke through Lucinda's defenses. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks as she accepted the handkerchief. "I'm Lucinda Caldwell," she managed between sobs, "and I've made a terrible fool of myself." Matthew shook his head. "I doubt that very much, Miss Caldwell." As the sun sank lower, painting the sky in vibrant pinks and purples, Lucinda found herself telling this stranger everything about Thomas, about her father's death, about her uncertain future. Matthew listened without interruption, his face darkening with anger when she described Thomas's cruelty. "Men like that," he said when she finished, "they don't deserve the time of day, let alone the tears of a lady like yourself." He stood, offering his hand. "It'll be dark soon. Let me take you into town. The widow Jensen runs a boarding house. She's a good woman. You'll be safe there tonight." Lucinda hesitated, then placed her hand in his, allowing him to help her to her feet. "Why are you helping me?" Matthew smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Because no one should face their troubles alone, Miss Caldwell, not when there are folks willing to lend a hand." As he helped her onto his horse, climbing up behind her with practiced ease, Lucinda felt something she hadn't expected, a flicker of hope, warm and fragile, igniting in her chest. The town of Silver Creek was small but tidy, Its main street lined with the essential businesses of frontier life: a general store, a blacksmith shop, a saloon, and a modest church. Lanterns were being lit as dusk settled over the buildings, casting a warm glow that welcomed them as Matthew guided his horse down the dusty thoroughfare. Lucinda was acutely aware of his presence behind her, the respectful way he kept a proper distance while still ensuring she was secure. His arms framed her without touching, his hands steady on the reins. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had shown her such consideration. They stopped outside a 2-story white clapboard house with a neat porch and window boxes filled with wildflowers. A sign hung above the door, "Jensen Boarding House." Before Matthew could dismount, the front door opened, and a plump woman with silver-streaked dark hair emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Matthew Hayes, what brings you to town at this hour?" Her curious gaze shifted to Lucinda, and her expression softened with understanding. Matthew swung down from the saddle, then helped Lucinda dismount. "Mrs. Jensen, this is Miss Lucinda Caldwell. She's in need of lodging for the night." The widow Jensen stepped forward, her keen eyes taking in Lucinda's tear-stained face and disheveled appearance. Rather than asking questions, she simply nodded. "Of course. I've got a nice room at the back, very quiet. You look like you could use some peace and a hot meal." Relief washed over Lucinda. "Thank you, but I'm afraid I don't have much money." "Nonsense," Matthew interrupted gently. "I'll take care of it." Lucinda turned to him, ready to protest, but the kindness in his eyes stopped her. "I can't accept. Consider it a loan if you must," he said. "You can pay me back when you're settled." Mrs. Jensen clucked her tongue. "Always the gentleman, this one. Come inside, dear. Supper's almost ready." As they stepped onto the porch, Matthew touched his hat. "I'll come by tomorrow to check on you if that's all right." Lucinda nodded, suddenly reluctant to see him go. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." His smile was warm. "Get some rest, Miss Caldwell. Things have a way of looking brighter in the morning." As he mounted his horse and rode away, Lucinda watched him disappear into the gathering darkness, wondering at the strange turn her day had taken. Hours ago, her world had shattered. Now, somehow, she felt the first tentative stirrings of something new taking root. Mrs. Jensen led her into a cozy parlor, mercifully empty of other boarders. "Sit yourself down, child. I'll fetch you some tea while we wait for supper." Lucinda sank gratefully into a cushioned chair, the events of the day catching up with her. "You're very kind, madam." The older woman waved away her thanks. "Matthew wouldn't bring just anyone to my door. If he thinks you're deserving of help, that's good enough for me." She paused, studying Lucinda with shrewd eyes. "He's a good man, that one. Best cowhand at Silver Creek, and the most honest soul you'll ever meet." Later, after a simple but hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread, Lucinda found herself in a small but clean room on the second floor. A patchwork quilt covered the narrow bed, and moonlight filtered through white curtains at the window. For the first time since discovering Thomas's betrayal, she allowed herself to truly breathe. She thought of Matthew Hayes, of his unexpected kindness to a stranger in distress. "You'll never cry alone again," he'd promised. Such a bold statement from someone who didn't know her at all. And yet there had been something in his eyes, something that made her want to believe him. Exhausted, Lucinda sank onto the bed, letting the tears come one last time. Tomorrow would be soon enough to figure out what came next. Morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the curtains and the aroma of coffee and bacon wafting up from below. Lucinda dressed in her rumpled clothes from the day before, wishing she had something fresher. Her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand showed red-rimmed eyes and tangled hair, but at least the wild desperation of yesterday had faded. Downstairs, Mrs. Jensen greeted her with a cup of coffee and a plate piled high with eggs, bacon, and biscuits. "Eat up," she encouraged. "A body needs strength to face the day." "Thank you," Lucinda said, realizing she was indeed hungry. "I was wondering, do you know of any work in town? I'm a skilled seamstress." Mrs. Jensen's eyes brightened. "As a matter of fact, Mrs. Abernathy at the general store was just saying yesterday that she's in need of help with alterations and mending. Her eyes aren't what they used to be." Hope flickered. "Would you be willing to introduce me?" "Of course, dear. We'll go over after breakfast." They were just finishing their meal when a knock sounded at the front door. Mrs. Jensen went to answer it, returning moments later with Matthew Hayes. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance. His hair was neatly combed, his shirt clean and pressed beneath his leather vest. "Good morning, Miss Caldwell," he said, hat in hand. "I hope you slept well." Lucinda felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "I did, thank you, and thank you again for your kindness yesterday." Mrs. Jensen excused herself with a knowing smile, leaving them alone in the dining room. Matthew cleared his throat. "I spoke with Mr. Richardson at the bank this morning. He says they've got a small cottage for rent on the edge of town. It belonged to the schoolteacher, but she moved to Denver last month. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and secure." Lucinda stared at him in surprise. "You've been busy this morning." He ducked his head, a faint blush coloring his tanned face. "I just thought if you were planning to stay in Silver Creek, you might need a place of your own." The consideration of his actions touched her deeply. "That's very thoughtful. Mrs. Jensen mentioned possible work at the general store. If that pans out, perhaps I could afford the cottage." His face brightened. "That's excellent news. I'd be happy to show you the place whenever you're ready." She should have been more cautious, more guarded after Thomas's betrayal, yet something about Matthew's straightforward manner put her at ease. "I'd like that. Perhaps after I speak with Mrs. Abernathy, I'll wait for you," he promised. The meeting with Mrs. Abernathy went better than Lucinda had dared hope. The older woman was impressed by the fine stitching on Lucinda's own dress, which she had made herself, and offered her steady work at a fair wage, plus the use of the store's sewing machine. She could start immediately. "It seems your luck is turning," Matthew observed as they walked toward the cottage later that morning. "I'm glad of it." "I still can't believe how quickly things are falling into place," Lucinda admitted. "After yesterday, I thought that everything was ending." He glanced at her, his blue eyes understanding. Sometimes what feels like an ending is just the start of something better. The cottage was small but charming, set back from the road with a view of the distant mountains. A single room with a small kitchen area, a pot-bellied stove for heat, and a curtained-off sleeping area. Simple, but more than adequate for one person. "It's perfect," Lucinda breathed, already imagining how she might make it her own. Matthew leaned against the doorframe, watching her explore. "The rent's reasonable. Richardson says he can give you the first month at half price to help you get settled." She turned to him, suddenly suspicious. "Did you arrange that?" He held up his hands. "I might have mentioned your situation, but Richardson's a fair man. He doesn't like to see a property sitting empty." Lucinda approached him, her heart full of gratitude. "Why are you doing all this for me? You don't even know me." Matthew's expression grew serious. "I know what it's like to feel lost, Miss Caldwell. After the war, I wandered for years before finding my place at Silver Creek. Sometimes a person just needs someone to believe in them until they can believe in themselves again." His words resonated deeply. "Well, I'm grateful, Mr. Hayes, truly." "Matthew," he corrected gently. "I think we've moved past formalities, don't you?" She smiled, the first genuine smile in what felt like ages. "Then you must call me Lucinda." The week that followed was a whirlwind of activity. Lucinda moved into the cottage, started work at the general store, and slowly began rebuilding her life. The people of Silver Creek were welcoming, accepting her without too many questions about her past. Mrs. Jensen provided her with some basic household items: dishes, linens, a few pots and pans, and Mrs. Abernathy paid her first week's wages in advance so she could purchase necessities. Matthew visited daily, sometimes bringing small gifts: a bunch of wildflowers, a jar of honey from the ranch, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy. He never stayed long, mindful of her reputation, but each visit left Lucinda looking forward to the next. On Sunday, he escorted her to church, a simple courtesy that nonetheless sent a clear message to the townsfolk that she was under his protection. Afterward, they walked to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. "My parents are buried here," Matthew explained as they passed through the iron gates. "They died of influenza when I was away fighting. By the time I made it back, they were gone." Lucinda's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry, that must have been terrible." He nodded, leading her to a modest stone marker. "It was. I felt like I'd failed them somehow, not being here when they needed me." You were serving your country, she said gently. They would have been proud. That's what Mrs. Jensen always says. She took me in when I returned, helped me find my way again. He knelt, clearing away some weeds from the base of the stone. What about your family? You mentioned your father passed. Lucinda nodded, kneeling beside him to help. Last winter. My mother died when I was young. It was just the two of us for most of my life. He was a good man, worked hard, taught me everything I know about horses and ranching. You miss him. Every day, she sighed. He would have seen through Thomas in an instant. He always could spot a liar. Matthew's hand covered hers briefly. He'd be proud of you now, I think, starting fresh, standing on your own 2 feet. His touch was warm, comforting. Lucinda found herself reluctant to pull away. I hope so. As May turned to June, Lucinda settled into her new life. Her work at the general store earned her a reputation as a skilled seamstress, and soon she had additional commissions from townspeople wanting dresses made or suits altered. She planted a small garden behind her cottage, filled with herbs and vegetables, and added little touches to make the place truly her own. Matthew remained a constant presence, respectful but attentive. Sometimes he brought her news of Thomas, apparently. The man had indeed married the banker's daughter from the neighboring town, but rumors suggested it was not a happy union. Lucinda found that the news no longer pained her as it once would have. One evening in late June, Matthew invited her to join him for a picnic by the creek where they'd first met. The day was perfect, clear blue skies, a gentle breeze, wildflowers dotting the meadows. He arrived at her cottage with a basket packed by Mrs. Jensen and a blanket tied behind his saddle. I thought we might ride double, he suggested. It's not far. Lucinda hesitated only briefly before accepting his outstretched hand and allowing him to pull her up behind him. She placed her hands tentatively on his waist, but as the horse began to move, she found herself holding on more securely, acutely aware of the solid strength of him. The creek was peaceful, the water running clear over smooth stones. Matthew spread the blanket beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree and unpacked the basket: fried chicken, potato salad, fresh bread, and Mrs. Jensen's famous apple pie. This is wonderful, Lucinda said, looking around at the tranquil setting. Hard to believe that just over a month ago I was sitting here crying my eyes out. Matthew smiled. Life can change mighty quick sometimes. They ate and talked, the conversation flowing easily between them. Matthew told her stories of his time at Silver Creek Ranch, of the characters he worked with, of the satisfaction he found in honest labor. Lucinda shared memories of her father, of growing up on a small ranch, of her dreams of someday having a place of her own again. As the afternoon waned, they walked along the creek, stopping to skip stones across the water like children. Lucinda's laughter rang out when Matthew's stone sank immediately, earning him a playful splash from her. That's how it is it? He grinned, his eyes alight with mischief. He scooped up a handful of water, threatening to retaliate. Lucinda backed away, hands raised in surrender. Don't you dare, Matthew Hayes, he lowered his hand, still smiling. Only because you asked so nicely. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them. The playfulness receded, replaced by something deeper, more intense. Matthew took a step toward her, then hesitated. Lucinda, he began, his voice suddenly serious. I know it hasn't been long since what happened with Thomas, and I don't want to rush you or make you uncomfortable. But I need you to know that I care for you deeply. Her heart quickened. Matthew, you don't have to say anything, he assured her quickly. I just wanted you to know where I stand. I'll wait as long as you need. Lucinda closed the distance between them, placing her hand on his arm. I care for you too, more than I thought possible, given everything, but you're right, it is soon. I'm still finding my footing. He covered her hand with his own. Then we'll take it slowly, no rush. The ride back to town was silent but comfortable, a new understanding between them. When he helped her down from the horse outside her cottage, his hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Lucinda looked up at him, her heart full of emotions she wasn't quite ready to name. Thank you for today, she said softly. My pleasure. He hesitated, then bent and placed a gentle kiss on her cheek. Good night, Lucinda. She watched him ride away, her fingers touching the spot where his lips had been, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The summer unfolded with a sweetness Lucinda had never expected to find again. Her business thrived, her garden flourished, and her friendship with Matthew deepened into something precious. They were careful, mindful of her reputation in the small town, but everyone could see the way they looked at each other. Matthew took her riding on his days off, showing her the beauty of the surrounding countryside. Sometimes they joined community gatherings, barn dances, church socials, the 4th of July celebration where the entire town gathered for a picnic and fireworks. Always, he was attentive without being possessive, respectful of her independence while making it clear he wanted to be part of her life. In August, tragedy struck the Silver Creek Ranch when a flash flood swept through a low-lying pasture, carrying away cattle and nearly drowning one of the younger hands. Matthew worked tirelessly for days, helping to salvage what they could and search for the missing animals. Lucinda didn't see him for nearly a week, though Mrs. Jensen kept her informed of his whereabouts. When he finally appeared at her door, he was exhausted, his face drawn with fatigue and sadness. "We lost 20 head," he reported, accepting the cup of coffee she pressed into his hands. "And young Billy Porter's still laid up with pneumonia from being in that cold water so long." Lucinda led him to her small table, making him sit while she prepared a plate of food. "Mrs. Jensen told me you've barely slept. There was too much to do." He rubbed a hand over his face. "The boss is taking it hard. Those cattle represent a significant loss." "And how are you taking it?" she asked gently, setting the food before him. Matthew looked up, surprised by the question. "Me, I'm fine, just tired." "Matthew," she sat across from him, taking his hand. "You don't have to be strong all the time, not with me." Something in his expression cracked. "I should have seen it coming. The signs were there the way the clouds were building over the mountains if I'd moved those cattle sooner." "You can't blame yourself for nature's fury," Lucinda said firmly. "No one could have predicted that flood. Billy's just a kid, 17, he was under my watch. And he's alive because of you," she reminded him. "Mrs. Jensen said you pulled him from the water yourself." Matthew stared down at their joined hands. "I keep seeing their faces, my men, looking to me for direction. The boss, counting on me to keep things running smoothly. Sometimes the weight of it all is too much to bear alone," she finished for him. She rose and moved around the table, wrapping her arms around his shoulders from behind. "You're not alone, Matthew, not anymore." He reached up, covering her hands with his own, drawing strength from her embrace. They stayed that way for a long moment, connected in the quiet of her small cottage. Later, after he'd eaten and rested, they sat on her tiny porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant colors. Matthew seemed more at peace, the burden he carried somewhat lightened. "Thank you," he said simply, his arm around her shoulders. Lucinda leaned against him, content. "For what?" "For reminding me that it's all right to lean on someone else sometimes," she smiled. "Wasn't it you who told me that no one should face their troubles alone?" He chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her. "Using my own words against me, are you?" "Only when they're good ones." Matthew turned to face her, his expression serious once more. "Lucinda, I've been thinking, the ranch foreman is retiring at the end of the year. The boss has hinted that the position might be mine if I want it." "Matthew, that's wonderful." "Of course you want it, you've worked so hard. It would mean more responsibility, but also more stability, a house of my own on the ranch property, a real future." His eyes held hers. "A future I'd like to share with you if you're willing." Lucinda's breath caught. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "Not yet," he clarified quickly. "I know you need more time, but I want you to know where my thoughts are heading. When I imagine my life in the years to come, you're always part of that picture." Joy blossomed in her chest. "You're part of my picture, too." He leaned forward, hesitating just a breath away from her lips. "May I?" In answer, she closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a tender kiss that held all the promise of tomorrow. The harvest season brought new challenges and joys. Matthew was busier than ever at the ranch, preparing for the cattle drive to the railhead and helping the boss evaluate which animals to keep for breeding and which to sell. Lucinda's sewing business boomed as people ordered new clothes for the coming winter. Despite their busy schedules, they made time for each other. Matthew began building furniture for Lucinda's cottage in his spare hours, a rocking chair for the porch, shelves for her growing collection of books, a hope chest that made her blush when he delivered it. "Just thinking ahead," he said with a wink that sent her heart racing. In October, just as the aspens were turning golden on the mountainsides, Billy Porter, now recovered from his bout with pneumonia, came galloping into town with alarming news: a gang of cattle rustlers had been spotted on Silver Creek land. The boss was organizing men to track them, and Matthew was leading the party. Lucinda felt a cold dread settle in her stomach when Matthew came to tell her himself. "I have to go," he said, standing in her doorway, his rifle already strapped to his saddle outside. "We can't let them get away with the herd, I know." She fought to keep her voice steady. "How dangerous will it be?" He didn't sugarcoat it. "These men are desperate. They won't give up the cattle without a fight." Lucinda nodded, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her apron. "When will you leave?" "Within the hour. I wanted to see you first." He reached for her hands, stilling their anxious movement. "I'll be back, Lucinda. You have my word." She forced a smile. "I'll hold you to that, cowboy." Matthew pulled her close, kissing her with a passion that left her breathless. When they parted, his eyes were dark with emotion. "I love you, Lucinda Caldwell. I should have said it before now." Tears pricked at her eyes. "I love you too. Please be careful, always." He kissed her once more, then turned to go, his tall figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Lucinda watched until he disappeared from view, her heart heavy with worry. That night, sleep eluded her as she imagined Matthew tracking dangerous men through the rugged countryside. The next day dragged endlessly as she went through the motions of work, her mind constantly straying to thoughts of him. 3 days passed with no word. The town buzzed with speculation and worry. Mrs. Jensen tried to reassure Lucinda, but her own concern was evident. "Matthew knows what he's doing," she said as they sat in Lucinda's cottage on the 3rd evening. "He was a scout during the war. If anyone can track those rustlers safely, it's him." Lucinda nodded, trying to draw comfort from the older woman's words. "I just wish there was some news." As if in answer to her plea, a commotion erupted outside. They rushed to the window to see riders entering the town, dusty and weary. Lucinda's heart leaped when she recognized Matthew at the front, leading a string of horses with bound men slumped in the saddles. She was out the door in an instant, Mrs. Jensen close behind. Matthew dismounted stiffly, wincing slightly, and handed the reins to the sheriff who had come to meet them. 4 rustlers, he reported. "We recovered all but 3 of the stolen cattle. Any casualties?" The sheriff asked, eyeing the captured men. "None on our side. One of theirs took a bullet in the shoulder when he tried to make a run for it, but he'll live to stand trial." Lucinda pushed through the gathering crowd, her eyes fixed on Matthew. When he saw her, his tired face brightened and he opened his arms. She went to him without hesitation, not caring who was watching. "You're hurt," she murmured, feeling him flinch as her arms went around him. "Just a bruise or two, nothing serious." He held her close, burying his face in her hair. "God, I missed you. Don't ever scare me like that again," she scolded, though there was no heat in her words. He laughed softly. "Yes, madam." Later, after the excitement had died down and the rustlers were safely locked in the town jail, Matthew sat in Lucinda's cottage while she tended to his injuries, a nasty bruise on his ribs where he'd been kicked by a horse, a cut on his arm from a branch he'd ridden under too quickly. "You're lucky it wasn't worse," she fussed, applying salve to the cut. "I had something important to come back to," he replied, catching her hand and kissing her palm. "Someone important." Lucinda's heart swelled. "I was so afraid. I know, I'm sorry for that." He reached into his pocket. "I had a lot of time to think out there on the trail about what matters most in life." He pulled out a small, worn velvet box. "This was my mother's. I've been carrying it since before the flood, waiting for the right moment." Lucinda's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "I know we haven't known each other that long," Matthew said, his voice earnest, "but when you know something's right, time doesn't much matter." He took her hand. "Lucinda Caldwell, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy filled her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Matthew slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a tender kiss, mindful of his bruised ribs. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "You know, when I found you crying by that creek, I never imagined we'd end up here. You promised I'd never cry alone again," she reminded him, smiling through her tears. "It seems you're a man who keeps his promises." "Always," he vowed, sealing the promise with another kiss. They were married in the small church of Silver Creek on the first Sunday of November 1878. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, even the ranch boss, who gave Matthew a week's leave for a honeymoon and the keys to the foreman's house as a wedding gift. Lucinda wore a dress of her own making, ivory satin with lace she'd salvaged from her mother's wedding gown. Mrs. Jensen stood in place of her mother, and Billy Porter, now devoted to the man who had saved his life, stood as Matthew's best man. As they spoke their vows, Lucinda thought of that desperate day by the creek, how she had believed her life was over, only to discover it was just beginning. She thought of Matthew's promise, "You'll never cry alone again," and how completely he had fulfilled it. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes yet again, but this time they were tears of pure joy, shared with the man who had helped her find her way back to happiness. The foreman's house on Silver Creek Ranch was larger than Lucinda had expected, a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch, 4 bedrooms, and a kitchen that made her heart sing. Matthew carried her across the threshold as tradition demanded, setting her down gently in what would be their home. "What do you think?" he asked, watching her explore with obvious delight. "It's perfect," she breathed, running her hand along the smooth wooden banister of the staircase. "More than I ever dreamed of." He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Room enough for a family when the time comes." Lucinda leaned back against him, savoring the warmth of his embrace. "A family," she echoed, the word filling her with wonder. "I'd like that very much." Their honeymoon week passed in a blur of happiness. They rode together across the vast ranch land, picnicked by the creek that had brought them together, and spent long evenings before the fire, talking of their hopes for the future. And when night fell, they discovered a deeper intimacy, learning each other's bodies with the same care they had taken in learning each other's hearts. When Matthew returned to work as the new foreman of Silver Creek Ranch, Lucinda set about making their house a home. She continued her sewing business, converting one of the downstairs rooms into a workshop where ladies from town and neighboring ranches could come for fittings. Her garden from the cottage was transplanted to a larger plot behind the house, and she began keeping chickens, delighting in the fresh eggs each morning. Winter descended on the New Mexico territory with a gentleness that matched their new life. Snow dusted the distant mountains but rarely troubled the valley where the ranch spread out. The cattle were fat and healthy, the hands content under Matthew's leadership, and the boss pleased with his choice of foreman. At Christmas, they hosted a gathering for the ranch hands who had no family nearby, filling the house with laughter and music. Matthew played the fiddle, a talent Lucinda hadn't known he possessed, while Billy Porter demonstrated a surprising aptitude for the harmonica. They danced in the cleared space of the parlor, Lucinda's skirts swirling as Matthew twirled her in time to the lively tunes. "You're glowing," Mrs. Jensen observed as they stood together in the kitchen, preparing plates of food for their guests. Lucinda smiled, touching her hand to her stomach in an unconscious gesture. "Am I?" The older woman's eyes widened. "Lucinda Hayes, is there something you're not telling me?" Lucinda glanced toward the parlor, where Matthew was deep in conversation with several of the hands. "I haven't even told him yet," she confessed in a whisper. "I wanted to be sure." Mrs. Jensen embraced her, tears glistening in her eyes. "Oh, my dear girl, what a blessing." "I'm going to tell him tonight after everyone leaves," Lucinda said, her heart full. "Do you think he'll be pleased?" "Pleased?" Mrs. Jensen laughed. "That man has been talking about having children with you since before he proposed. He'll be over the moon." Later, when the last guest had departed and they stood alone before the dying fire, Lucinda took Matthew's hands in hers. "I have a Christmas gift for you," she said softly. "One I couldn't wrap." His eyebrows rose in curiosity. "Oh, and what might that be, Mrs. Hayes? In about 7 months," she said, guiding his hand to rest on her still flat abdomen, "you're going to be a father." Matthew stared at her, his expression transforming from confusion to wonder to unbridled joy. "A baby, we're having a baby," Lucinda nodded, laughing as he lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a circle before setting her down with sudden care. "I didn't hurt you, did I, or the baby?" His concern was touching. "We're fine," she assured him, "strong as can be according to Doc Wilson." Matthew knelt before her, his hands cradling her middle with reverence. "Hello in there," he whispered. "I'm your pa and I can't wait to meet you." He looked up at Lucinda, his eyes shining with tears. "I never thought I could be this happy." She stroked his hair, her own eyes damp. "Nor I, but here we are." "Here we are," he agreed, rising to take her in his arms again, his kiss a promise of all the joy still to come. Spring returned to the territory with a riot of wildflowers and the sound of newborn calves calling for their mothers. Lucinda's body changed with the season, her middle rounding as their child grew within her. Matthew was attentive to her every need, insisting she rest more and hiring a local girl to help with the housework. In June, exactly 1 year after their picnic by the creek where Matthew had first hinted at a future together, their daughter was born after a long but uncomplicated labor. They named her Margaret Rose after both their mothers, but called her Maggie from the first moment. "She has your eyes," Lucinda said weakly, watching as Matthew cradled their tiny daughter with hands that seemed suddenly too large and rough for such a delicate task. "But your spirit, I think," he replied, marveling at the way the infant gripped his finger. "She's perfect, Lucinda, absolutely perfect." As summer faded into autumn and autumn gave way to winter once more, their life settled into a rhythm sweetened by Maggie's presence. She grew quickly, a happy child with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination. Matthew was a devoted father, often carrying Maggie with him as he went about his duties on the ranch, introducing her to horses and cattle as if she could understand every word. "She'll be riding before she can walk at this rate," Lucinda observed one evening as she watched Matthew demonstrate to their 6-month-old daughter the proper way to hold reins. He grinned unrepentantly. "Is there a better way to grow up?" "I suppose not," she conceded, remembering her own childhood on horseback. "Just promise me you won't put her on a horse alone until she's at least 3. 2.5, he countered, eyes twinkling. Lucinda shook her head, but she was smiling. "You're impossible." "And yet you love me anyway." "I do," she agreed, settling beside them on the porch swing. "Very much." The years flowed one into the next, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their growing family. Maggie was joined by a brother, Michael, when she was 2, and then by another sister, Laura, 3 years after that. The house that had once seemed so spacious now rang with children's laughter and the occasional squabble. Lucinda's sewing business continued to thrive, though she limited her hours to accommodate motherhood. Matthew's position as foreman brought stability and respect, and when the old ranch boss decided to retire in 1887, he offered Matthew a partnership. It was an opportunity that required all their savings and a loan from the bank, but they agreed it was worth the risk. "Just think," Matthew said as they looked over the papers that would make him part owner of Silver Creek Ranch. 10 years ago, I was just a hired hand and you were crying by a creek. Look how far we've come." Lucinda squeezed his hand. "We built this life together one day at a time." "And we'll keep building," he promised. "For the children, for ourselves." In the spring of 1888, they celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together friends from town and workers from the ranch. The children were scrubbed and dressed in their Sunday best, though 5-year-old Michael managed to find mud within minutes of the guests' arrival. As twilight fell, lanterns were lit in the yard, and music started up. Matthew claimed Lucinda for a dance, drawing her close as they swayed beneath the stars. "Happy, Mrs. Hayes," he murmured against her hair. "Completely," she assured him. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. "Do you ever think about that day, when we first met?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "I was so lost, so heartbroken, I couldn't imagine ever being happy again." He nodded. I remember thinking you were the saddest, most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. All I wanted was to make you smile. You've given me so much more than smiles, Matthew. She touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that 10 years had etched around his eyes, lines of laughter, of squinting into the sun, of living fully. You gave me a reason to hope again, a family, a home. You gave me those things too, he reminded her. We gave them to each other. From across the yard, 8-year-old Maggie called out, "Pa, come quick. Michael's trying to ride the pony by himself," Matthew sighed, pressing a quick kiss to Lucinda's lips. "Duty calls." She laughed, watching as he strode across the yard to prevent their son from embarking on an ill-advised equestrian adventure. This was their life moments of tenderness interrupted by the beautiful chaos of family, days of hard work rewarded by nights of peaceful togetherness. Later, after the guests had departed and the children were finally asleep, Lucinda and Matthew sat on the porch swing, a quilt draped over their laps against the spring chill. The moon cast silver light over the land that was now partly theirs, the land where their children would grow up, where they would grow old together. "I've been thinking," Matthew said, his arm around her shoulders. "We should plant an orchard on that south-facing slope near the creek. Apple trees, maybe some cherry. By the time Michael's old enough to take over the ranch, they'll be bearing fruit." Lucinda smiled at his forward thinking. "Always planning for the future, aren't you? Our future," he corrected. "And our children's, that's what it's all about, isn't it? Building something that lasts." She nestled closer, content in the warmth of his embrace. "Yes, that's exactly what it's about." As they sat in comfortable silence, Lucinda thought about the long road that had brought them to this moment, from a chance meeting by a creek, through courtship and marriage, the birth of their children, the growth of their shared dreams. There had been challenges along the way, droughts and blizzards, illness and injury, the normal trials of life on the frontier. But through it all, they had faced each obstacle together, stronger for their partnership. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" she asked softly. "When you found me crying," Matthew smiled, the memory clear despite the passing years. "I said you'd never cry alone again. And I haven't," she affirmed, "not once in all these years." "And you never will," he promised, just as he had that day in 1878, sealing his vow with a kiss beneath the vast New Mexico sky. Surrounded by the life they had built together, a life founded on a simple act of kindness beside a creek, where a heartbroken woman had fled in tears, until a cowboy sat beside her and changed both their lives forever.